All right, here we are in After Effects Assignment 4. There's the assignment. I already talked about it, so I'm not going to bore you with that again. Let's hop right into After Effects and start working. Well, maybe we should do a storyboard here quick. After Effects. Let's get rid of Tom Cruise. We're not doing that anymore. So we're just going to start a new project. Notice that I didn't give you any specific composition settings because I don't know what you're shooting or creating for this. You guys can kind of determine what you want your composition settings to be for this project. A good safe way to put it is like it should be probably at least 1080p. If you want to do a 4K project, that's fine. Please make sure you compress it if it's a 4K project because that'll take up tons of space really quick. Yeah, let's hop right in here. So particles can be used for a million different things. So somebody spit out an idea that we can make something with particles.
Harry Potter spit.
Wait, somebody said waterfall.
I did.
Waterfall? All right, Alex. Let's do something that looks like water. That sounds fun. Okay, so I'm not going to do a storyboard for this. We did last week. We're going to just like look at some stuff online real quick and see if we can add something that looks waterfall-y to something. That's totally doable. And then what we'll do is we'll bring that image in and we'll start manipulating the particles to kind of emulate what water might look like. I will be straightforward with you. CC Particle World is only a so-so particle generator. So you're going to have to use tricks to make your stuff look a little more realistic. One term you're going to hear me say a lot tonight is layer up. So what layering up means is you can start with a set of particles and then you can create a layer, maybe blur it, start using blending modes, maybe change the seed in the particles, which we'll get to, which will change the way that they look, adding more and more dimension to your particles as you work through them. Generally, the way that I work with particle systems is I like to get a base particle system set up, and then I'll take that base particle system and work it from there. So I'll make changes, duplicate it, make changes to it until I get to a place where I'm liking the way that the effect feels. So let's find something that we can do with water. I'm going to head on over to the Googles and we'll go to images and I'm going to set my settings to labeled for reuse with modification. And I'm going to, let me think. Let's see if we can't maybe add some water to a hose or something like that. Yeah, see, this is kind of a good reference right here. These like firefighter guys shooting water out of their little fire hoses. All right, I'm just gonna grab this like gray garden hose thing here, and we're gonna try to make this look like there's water flowing out of one end, even though the other end doesn't have anything plugged into it. We're gonna make water look like it's coming out of there. Best we can. You guys can pick whatever you want. I'm gonna kind of give a general rundown of how the particle system kind of works first, and then we'll go about kind of manipulating it and making it do the things that we want it to do. Can I download your photo? There it is. So I'm just going to save this image into a folder. So it would be a good idea for you guys to go ahead and make a folder for this. Make a new folder, assignment 4. Go in there, and then we'll call this the hose JPEG and save that into our folder. And then we'll get right over into After Effects and start playing around with this a little bit. I'll be straightforward. Like the hose isn't the like most creative thing ever, but it will definitely be challenging for us to make that look like there's actually water coming out of the end of it. So it's not a bad challenge. But feel free to get more creative with the stuff that you guys are doing on your end. Okay, so I've got my hose JPEG. Notice it's 900 by 600 resolution. So I'm going to create my composition from the JPEG itself. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to go ahead and drag this JPEG onto this little composition icon in the project window and let go, and it will create my composition for me. I'm going to check those settings just to see Yep, it's 24 frames per second, which is what I like. I did say 7 to 10 seconds. I'm going to stick with 7 seconds, and I'm just going to set this to fit my screen and then shut off the project window with Command 0. All right, does everybody have an image? Need more time? Yes, no, maybe so. Yes, more time? All right, cool. You guys go. All right, so I got to do that all over again because I forgot to record it, so that's my fault. So here we go. We got our hose. We decided instead of making our hose spray water, we're going to make our hose spray smoke and fire, which I thought was kind of fun. So we're going to go ahead and create particles there. We're making a new layer solid. We are coloring this solid orange and naming it particles. You can use the solid color in your particles if you want to. And then we're going to go up into the effects and presets box. We're going to type in particle, and you were looking for CC particle world. That is the effect we're going to use. And then we're going to drag and drop it onto our solid, and you should see this. Everybody there?
Yep.
Okay. So first, before we try to do any manipulation of this, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through each of the areas of this specific effect and talk about them a little bit and see what they do. So a lot of this initially is just going to be like, this controls this controls this, etc., etc. So let's start with grid and guides. So open up in your effects control panel. You've got CC Particle World. You should be seeing that, and you should see all this fun stuff. Grid and guides, birth rate, longevity, producer, physics, particle, and extras. Is everybody there? Okay, so grid and guides basically just controls what's going on with what you're seeing when you're working with the particle system. So in order to see the grid and guides, you actually have to have CC Particle World selected in your effects control panel. If you deselect it, you will not see any grids or guides on your image. So make sure you click on that layer, and then you'll notice that you've got a little controller in the upper left-hand corner. You have an emitter, you have kind of a horizon line, and then you have a grid down at the bottom. That's what you guys should be seeing. We all good? We're there? Cool. Okay, so grid and guides just basically allows you to control what you're seeing in the interface when you're working with it. You can turn on and off all these different little motion path, radius, position, etc. I don't really tend to have to shut these off when I'm working with CC Particle World, but if for whatever reason you don't want to see something, you're going to control that in grid and guides. There's grid subdivisions, there's grid size. This can be handy if you're trying to, say, make your particles bounce off of something. Like, let's say you have a firework explode in the middle of a road and you want the particles to bounce off of the road down below. Well, you can use the grid on the bottom as your solid surface for the particles to bounce off of. So you might want to line that grid up with the road. There's all kinds of ways to use this stuff. So birth rate. Anybody got a guess as to what birth rate does?
How fast the things spawn from their position?
That is correct. It's how many particles are being born, how many per second, or at what rate. This is just an arbitrary value. In better particle system generators like Trapcode Particular, that's going to be a lot more specific to how many particles are being generated per second. This is a little bit different. So it's just 2. This is what 2 particles birth rate looks like. If you increase that number, you will notice that lots more particles are now on your screen, and it will take a lot more time to render. So work with the birth rate sparingly at first. Otherwise, it will take forever to render things. Don't forget that if you want to make your renders go faster, you can change the settings down here in the composition window from full to, say, half or third, and that will help the particles render quicker, but they will look much more crappy. That's totally okay to do that. That's just for preview. That's not the way they're going to look when they're done. I personally like to try to work with particles in full resolution because they can look very different depending on that downsampling that you're doing. And you're definitely going to want to check them in full resolution before you go to render. So I'm going to go back to full, and I'm just going to bring my, my birth rate back to 2. And it should render 2 really easily, especially if you're working with the same 900 by 600 image that I'm working with right now. Birth rate can be animated. So if we wanted to, say, make a burst of particles happen on the screen, we can add some keyframes to this, right? You guys all know how to remember how to add keyframes. So let's say I want to create a burst of particles at 1 second. So what I would do is click the little stopwatch for birth rate, and then down here in the particles layer, you can push U. That will reveal all of your animated keyframes. And birth rate will pop up down there. And what we can do is we can set that birth rate to 0. So now no particles are being born. Then we can scoot over a frame or two and set that birth rate to 10. And then we can scoot over a couple more frames and set it back to 0. And we get a small burst of particles. Who wants to see that again? So this is what it looks like, just a small little firework of particles happening. So we're doing that just by animating the birth rate. So let's look at it one more time, shall we?
And you can also do it where it's like over time, just more and more start spraying out.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you could take these 3 keyframes that you just created and copy them and paste them, and you get another burst of particles. But say instead of birth rate of 10, we make it a birth rate of 50 on the next one. We're going to get a much heavier burst of particles. So there's our 10, there's our 50. All right, so again, all we're doing is we're animating the birth rate. So remember, your effects control panel will allow you to set keyframes, but you won't actually be able to see the keyframes unless you're in the layer below. So you're going to want to open up particles. So you can get at that by going into particles, into the effects tab, and then CC Particle World will be in there, and that will give you access to all of the keyframes that you're going to want to control when you're working with particles. So again, all I did was I went to the birth rate, set the keyframe like we do with position or any of the transforms that we've been working with, and then I set that birth rate to 0. Added another keyframe a couple of frames over at a birth rate of 10, which gives me a pop of particles, and then another 0 keyframe, which will basically turn the particles on and off. So this will allow you to position the particles starting and stopping or flowing whenever you want them to. And you can move these keyframes around anywhere in your composition, and that's when the particles will be emitted. You guys still with me? We good? Any questions? Nobody's got any questions? Everybody was able to make the particles turn on and off? Yes? Okay, good. All right, so the next thing, longevity. What do you guys think longevity does?
How far it goes each second?
Okay, that's kind of it. It's how long the particles live, right? Particles have a life. And the longevity basically says the particles are only living for this many seconds, right? So longevity right now on all of our particles is 1 second. So you can see that when they start on the screen, they're a nice bright yellow, and then over time, as they die, they become red, right? And you can see that, let's see, if I put this at this burst of 10 on the 1 second mark, and I move over to 2 seconds, all of the particles are nearly dead. There's a little bit of a couple of stragglers because the particle birth rate is going from 0 to 10 and then back to 0 over the course of 2 frames. If we made that 1 frame, they would be gone at exactly 2 seconds. If we increase the longevity to 2 seconds, of course, they're going to last for 2 seconds, so the particles won't fully die until they either leave the screen or until we get to 3 seconds. Does that make sense, you guys? So they have a birth and they have a death, and you can control both of those things. Longevity, unfortunately, isn't animatable in CC Particle World, which is one of those things that kind of make it not the best particle generator ever. So we can't arbitrarily change the longevity. If you did want to create a particle system where the longevity was different, you would basically just duplicate it and change the longevity so that you had a shorter life of particles for that specific layer. All right, so we've got birth rate, we've got longevity, all that good stuff. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and reset the whole system. So click on CC Particle World up in the effects controls and just push reset, and then let's get rid of all of our animations. So to get rid of the animation, all I did was click on the birth rate stopwatch, and that shut off all of my animation. And we're basically back to the stock particle world when we start. So it's just spewing particles at us. All right, let's keep moving here. So we've got producer. So the producer tab allows you to control the position of where the particles are being generated. So if you click on CC Particle World, the producer is basically this little red circle in the middle. I'm going to shut off the background layer so that you guys can see this a little bit better. So the producer is a little red circle right in the middle, and with the producer options, we can move the X, Y, and Z point to where the particles are being produced. And this can create a variety of different effects. Like, let's say we were trying to create rain, right? Well, we might want our producer to be way up above the camera, and we might want to increase the longevity a little bit of our particles. And when the particles start to fall, you can see they have a completely different look because the producer is in a totally different place. So the producer and controlling the producer will allow you to create a lot of different effects with your particles. Like, let's say we wanted this rain to look less like it's coming out of a little sphere and more like it was coming from a big cloud up in the sky. Well, we could take the radius of our producer and increase or decrease its radius on the x-axis, and that's going to spread all those particles out from that producer, and it's going to give it a much different look. All of this stuff is also animatable, so you can control the producer and you can animate the size, constraint, its position in X, Y, and Z space, etc., to create different looks. So if I make this producer really huge and I push start, it's going to start to look a lot more like a waterfall or a rain might look. Or sparks showering down from something up above. All right, I'm going to reset my particle world one more time, get it back to its base look. I'm going to close up grids and guides here too. And we're back basically to the same thing. So you guys understand the producer makes it move, change position. One thing to just keep in mind, particle world doesn't use the same pixel-based positioning that, say, layers do, right? Like a layer, when we look at a layer and its position, it's based on how many pixels are in the composition. So for this particular composition, if we just open the position on the hose, its position is 450 by 300, which is half of 900 by 600. So that, that image is centered at 450 by 300. Well, particle world works in its own arbitrary positioning system. So it's a little difficult to do things like motion track these particular particles to an object. Like if you wanted to motion track these, you'd have to do some expressions and crap like that to make it work. So just understand that if you're trying to do any funky motion tracking stuff, it'll get a little hairy. That's one thing I've been wishing that Adobe would change about Particle World for years and years now. Make it the same freaking position system. I'm talking to you, Adobe. Just in case they see it, they won't see it.
They're listening in.
Yeah, highly doubt it. Okay, so moving right along, let's go into physics. All right, this is where it gets crazy. So physics will allow you to control how your particle systems are reacting physically in the world, right? So we've got all kinds of fun things to play with. Let's play with the animation preset first. So the animation preset stock is set to explosive, which means the particles are exploding out of the emitter. Let's just go through these and look at the different options that we have. So I changed from explosive to direction axis. And that will allow you to kind of make your particles move in a specific axis. So if we want our hose to shoot fire out of it, we might want to use the directional axis and then position the emitter at the end of the hose, maybe do a little bit of masking, maybe some changes in terms of the gravity and how the particles are affected. But this will allow us to kind of make the particles spit in a specific direction. You'll also notice that we have a new guide here. So up at the top, we have like a direction emitter controller, basically. So we can kind of change the orientation of where the particles are being emitted in 3D space by grabbing onto this little emitter and kind of turning it in different directions. I'm going to go ahead and reset one more time and get it back to its original settings. So that's direction axis. You've got cone axis too, which kind of acts like a fountain of particles. So if you wanted to create like a fountainy water look, that might work really well. All you need to do is change the color of the particles and maybe add some layers and things like that to make it look a little more interesting, and you kind of have a more watery look. If we let this go ahead and animate, you can see that the particles are spit up in the air and then they come falling down. Viscous. Viscous is supposed to be more like watery, I guess, more waterfall-y. It looks very similar to explosive, but it's a little bit different in terms of how the particles come spitting out of the emitter. Twirl. Pretty straightforward. Makes the particles twirl around the emitter. So this would be great for creating like vortexes or creating tornadoes or things like that. Twirly is kind of a different version of twirl. The particles are spread much further out from the emitter and are swirling around the emitter as well. Then we got vortex. Vortex is also good for tornadoes. If you want to make hyperspace, this is a great way to make hyperspace. Just turn the angle towards the camera and now you have a portal warping you to another dimension. Amazing. Vortex. Fire. Fire is obviously good for fire. The particles, instead of dropping down, are now moving up in the air, so gravity has the opposite effect when you're using fire, and you will notice that there is gravity control inside of our physics. Let's keep on cruising here. Jet sideways. This is another one. This one's great for like if you wanted to create a fire effect of like a rocket in space or something like that, and you wanted that big wide plume of fire coming out of the booster. That would work pretty good for that. Fractal Omni. This is weird. This particular emitter just is kind of like sends the particles out in all kinds of random positions. So I'm grabbing onto the little XYZ box in the upper left-hand corner. I'm just kind of twirling around my particles to look at them from different angles because they do exist in 3D space. And you can see that this Omni fractal thing just has the particles spitting out in all kinds of strange orientations. Same with Fractal Uni. That kind of has a similar like fountain style spritz going up from the emitter, but you can see in a few areas the particles come out in different orientations. I'm going to go ahead and reset again and just get this all back to its original settings. So those are all the different animation types that you can use on your particles. Then we get into all the fun stuff in terms of animation properties for physics. We've got velocity, which controls how quickly the particles move out of the emitter. The lower the velocity, like you can make this look like it's pouring if you turn the velocity way down. So like if you wanted to say have sludge pouring out of a pipe or something like that, controlling the velocity and slowing it way down would be a good way to kind of create the illusion of something pouring out of a hole. You can also, of course, make the particles explode out of the emitter much more quickly if you ramp the velocity way up, and you can of course animate this over time. So like let's say we had a sludge pipe from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and all of a sudden it was going to explode sludge everywhere. Well, maybe it starts out at like 0.03 and starts pouring sludge, and then say at like 3 seconds in we set a keyframe and slowly have this ramp up over the course of a second, and the sludge starts to spray out of the little pipe. And that's kind of what this would look like. So we've got our sludge pouring, and then all of a sudden starts coming out of the pipe. So all kinds of ways for you to control the physical properties of your particles. Let's keep on moving. I'm going to go ahead and reset again and just turn off my animation. so I don't have anything going. Inherit velocity. Inherit velocity is really interesting. This one works much better when you have particle systems that are moving. If you make the particle system move, inherit velocity means that the particles will inherit the velocity of the moving emitter, right? So what does that look like, Todd? All right, well, let's find out. So if I go up into my producer and I have this particle system change position over time, I'm just going to set some keyframes here and animate this producer moving around a little bit. You can follow me if you want to on this. You don't have to. This is purely just for demonstration purposes. I'm going to have this kind of move around and create some different keyframe effects here. I'm adding some X and Y animation to this stuff so that you can see what this looks like. So obviously we've got this big green line which is showing where the particles are moving. I'm going to just do a little more of this so that you can see what this is going to look like if you move the particle system around and add inherent velocity. Okay, so now our particle system is moving around the screen and we have 0% inherited velocity. So let's take that inherited, and this is what it looks like. So here's what it looks like with no inherited velocity. The particles just kind of come out of the emitter and fall down to the ground. If we add inherent velocity to this, say 100%, now it's going to take on the movement of the emitter. So you'll notice that the particles are being pushed in the direction of the emitter. So let's say we have video of a little girl. She's dressed up as a fairy and she's got a magic wand and she wants to shoot magic out of the end of her magic wand. Well, we motion track the end of the magic wand and we have it inherit velocity, and now we can make her flick particles out of the end of her magic wand. That's what you might use this for. So there's inherit velocity, and that of course is animatable. So if you wanted to have particles not inherit or inherit, you can animate that and create some interesting effects that way. All right, I'm going to again shut off my animation and just reset this. Let's talk about gravity. All right, so all these particle systems usually have gravity, and gravity's great. You can set the gravity to 0 if you want your particles to just fly out into space and not be constrained by gravity. This is another great way to do that kind of Star Wars hyperspace look. Just turn the gravity off and maybe turn the velocity way up. Maybe give them a little more longevity. More than that. There we go. Boom, hyperspace. You can also have negative gravity. So if you wanted your particles to fall up, you could have negative gravity, and now your particles will emit and fall up into the sky. Smoke falls up, right? So when you have something that's smoking, the particles are going to rise into the air. You could also change the animation types to like the fire or the different ones that rise up into the air with the normal gravity. That will work that way as well. I'm going to reset this again. Resistance. Resistance is kind of cool. So when you turn up resistance, it basically like pushes back in on the particle system. So if you want to slow the particles way down and really contain them around the emitter, resistance is how you can do that. It's great for, making things look like sludge or goo or ice, or just slowing down the look and the speed of your particles. I think I've used this in the past with like no gravity to kind of create like a really cool looking like sun effect, like layer it up a bunch, add some blur to it, add some blending modes and maybe a little bit of a flare or something like that, and give it some good resistance, and it gives it this kind of like percolating, nuclear fusion-y type of look. Reset again. Extra and extra angle. So this doesn't work for explosive, but any of the ones that have an axis on them, like directional axis, you can control the angle of the directional axis with extra angle and extra. So extra kind of makes the particle system kind of fan out and do funky stuff. So like I increased the extra angle quite a bit on this, and you can see that it really changes the way that the emitter is spraying particles out. Kind of like creates this wild looking like comb of emitted particles. So those don't necessarily work on explosive, but they do work on anything that's got that axis marker on it. So if you stop and you see this, if you see this little gizmo right here, you can use extra and extra angle to change the way that the particles are being sprayed out of the emitter. Okay, floor. This is really cool. So the floor is a great way to make your particles interact with something solid, right? And in this particular particle emitter, the floor is the grid. So if you can see the grid on your screen, that is the floor. So if you open up the floor and you turn on your floor action, say set it to ice, you'll notice that now the particles hit the floor and slide out like they're hitting a piece of ice. That's how we created the fire coming out of the dragon's mouth and hitting the shield. We set the grid where the shield was, and then the particles come out, hit the shield, and spray off in different directions. You've also got glue, which means the particles will just stick to the floor. So I don't know what particles would necessarily stick to, but if you want to create that effect, that is how you do it. And then bounce is really cool too. So bounce means that the particles will hit the floor and bounce off. So like if you're creating sparks for something, like some kind of laser blast or something like that, and it's interacting with the floor or a wall, you can actually have the little sparks that you're creating bounce off of these grid objects. You can also control the bounciness. So if you want them to bounce less or more, you can increase the bounciness or the randomness of the bounce. All kinds of neat ways to control your particles. I'm going to go ahead and reset one more time. Direction axis. Direction axis again works on the objects that have the little direction gizmo in them. So if you see this little T gizmo at the top, you can control the X, Y, and Z axis of your particles right there. Some of these are kind of funky the way they work. So if you're trying to make something, spray out of a certain direction, you just kind of got to play around with it a little bit to make it work the way that you want it to. Resetting again. Gravity vector. So gravity vector allows you to control which way the particles are falling. So not only can you make gravity negative, but you can make it fall left, right, or up and down. So if I change the gravity to -1, the gravity will fall up now instead of down. If I add gravity to the x-axis, it will fall up and to the right or up and to the left. So that it just allows you to make the particles fall in the direction that you want them to fall in. I'm going to reset one more time. And honestly, the physics is really where the magic of the particles happens. Like when you're manipulating your particles, that's where you want to be, is in the physics part of it. All right, particle. We're going to get through all of these settings, and then we'll go ahead and take a break, you guys. All right, here we go. So particle. We can use all kinds of different particle types, right? So we've been looking at the line particle the whole time. Let's just step through all these different types. You got stars. Ooh. You got shaded spheres, faded spheres, darkened and faded spheres, bubbles. The bubble, by the way, is terrible. So if you really want to make bubbles, find like a really cool bubble JPEG, and then you can actually use it as a texture for your particles too. I can show you guys how to do that a little bit later. We've got bubble. We got motion polygons. So you wouldn't think that motion polygons would be very effective, but if you add some motion blur to these things, who was it, JT that needed to learn how to add motion blur? All right, so JT, here's how you add motion blur. So what you're going to do is you're going to be on your layer, and then right here, you may need to hit toggle switches modes. If you're seeing the track mats and the blending modes, click toggle switches modes down at the bottom. But you're looking for this little 3 circle deal right here, and then right under that is the switch for motion blur. And then you need to make sure that the big motion blur button at the top of your composition is clicked, and then you will have motion blur on your particles. I forget if this actually affects particles or not. I don't think it does, which is lame. Okay, but we can force it. So there's another effect called force motion blur that will force motion blur on anything in your composition. So if you really wanted these to have motion blur, you can make it so. Increase the size of these a little bit so you can actually see what they look like. And now we've got kind of motion blurry little particles flying out. JT, you have a question, or are you just stretching?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Make it so when you're like on the picture and you're like manipulating it with the grid and whatever on the screen, so it doesn't, you know how there's the box around it?
Yep.
How do you make it so it
Oh, so if you want to move the particle system, you have to do it in the producer. So if you take particles and you move it with position, yes, it's going to cut off on the edges, exactly as you just stated. So like if I have my particles flying out over there and I move these, they are going to cut off. Like if I move them up, you're going to see a definitive edge down there at the bottom. So you want to do any moving of the particles with the producer instead of the position of the layer. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Cool. All right, so we were looking at all the different particle types.
They look like Doritos.
They do look like Doritos.
Who doesn't need a Dorito factory?
So motion polygon is like little triangles. We've got motion square, which is little squares. We got tri-polys. Okay, these you can use motion blurs on. So there's certain types of particles that you can use motion blur on, and some of them you can't. I don't know why it's designed that way, but it is the way it is. All right, so we got tri-polys. You can definitely see the motion blur playing on the tri-poly. We got quad polys, which are basically like boxes. So like if you move these around, you can see that these are indeed 3D like flat boxes. If you say wanted to create like a cacophony of papers flying around a room, this is a great way to do that. Like you can create the quad polys and have them like vortexing around the room. I've actually done that for a visual effect before and used Particle World to do that very thing. I also like shot some live action paper flying around the room, and I mixed the two together, and it created a really wonderful effect. Textured tri-poly. So this one, if you click on this one, you're going to see nothing but black on your screen. And that is because in order for this to work, you actually have to have an image, and you need to attach the image to the particle system in order to see it. So let's say if you wanted to create like the little bubbles, or you wanted to create smoke or something like that and give it a more dynamic look, you could have a small image or JPEG of smoke and attach it down here at the bottom. Let's see. So there's a texture option right underneath the particle type. You can tell it what layer you want it to look at as a texture. I mean, you can use that as a texture. This is great for creating smoke elements. Like if you bring in like a little smokelet, is what they call them, like or a little picture of a cloud, you can create really cool looking smoke effects by using actual imagery instead of the built-in particle types. So anything that says textured on it, you have to have a texture layer source in order to see the particles. So we'll skip over tri-poly and quad poly. Tetrahedron is actually spitting out like pyramids. These are great because you can create a little bit more volume with your particles this way, and you can actually light them, and we'll get to that a little bit later. They've got this volume shader in here, which allows you to kind of change the lighting on your particles. Cube spits out little cubes. Cheese cubes, yep. Little chunks of Velveeta. Let's see, we got cubes, lens, convex, and concave. These ones work off of the actual color of the layer itself, which is why I made the color of the layer a color that I might use for fire or something like that. Lens convex, lens concave. They both have a very similar look. Lens faded, just basically has some faded edges on it. This is great for creating like fiery looks and things like that, especially when you start using it with in conjunction with some of the physics. Like if we turn this to let's see, what was it, vortex or fire, you can start creating some nice blurry kind of like crazy looking particle systems that way. If you change the birth and the death size too, that can really change the way that your particle systems are reacting. Lens darkened and faded is just a tighter, smaller looking faded lens. Lens bubble, again, the bubbles are terrible. You may find a use for them, but I hate it when I see Particle World bubbles in anybody's work because the bubbles just look awful. And then we got textured disc, textured square, and textured faded disc. So let's play with this a little bit. I find this is kind of a fun part of this deal. So let's go back out to Google, and I'll show you guys how to link a texture to your particles. So if you want to say, you know, like have a million skulls spraying out of a particle generator, we can do that. So I'm going to find a nice tiny little skull cartoon, something that's really, so the thing to keep in mind here is when you're using a texture in your particle systems, it is going to have to reference the image hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times to create the effect, right? So you want to use a small image. You definitely don't want to pull in like a 4K image and use that as a texture, because it will take infinity to render it. So you want to find something nice and tiny, or find something that you like and bring it into After Effects and make it even smaller. I like this really weird looking little, like, you know, drawn skull right here. That's kind of cool. I'm going to click on this and I'm going to go ahead and open the image in a new tab and save it real quick. Skull PNG. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring it into Photoshop, and I'm doing this really fast because I just want to kind of show you what you guys can do with textures. So I'm going to bring it into Photoshop. I'm going to cut the skull out really rudimentarily, make it a PNG on alpha, and then I can bring it in and attach it and make my particle system shoot little skulls everywhere. So I'm going to go ahead and open my little skull. Open this bad boy up. Holy buckets, look at all this garbage over here. I'm gonna come in here and I'm just gonna quickly, I think what I'm gonna do is first I'm gonna crop this down because I just want the skull, I don't want the crossbones. Crop this down, hit return, and then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and duplicate this. Oh, it's an index, so that's not going to help me very much. So if you have anything with funky color systems on it, like Index or CMYK, they're not going to import into After Effects. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this, shut the background off, and then all I'm going to do is just delete. And I'm going to do this, like I said, super rough. Doesn't have to be perfect. I'm just taking my little lasso tool and kind of drawing a selection around the edge of my skull. I'm doing Command Shift Inverse, and I'm going to delete out all the stuff around the edge of the skull, and then I'm going to save this as its own tiny little PNG. Image is going to be itty bitty. Okay, that's, yeah, perfect. 123 pixels by 134. Perfect size. I'm going to just crop this in a little bit tighter just to make this as easy on After Effects as possible. There we go. And I'm going to save this out as a PNG. This is going to work really well for little tiny skulls flying out of our particle system. Skull part. Saving, saving. Okay, so I've got my PNG all cut out. I bring that into my project. Skull part PNG. And then I have to put it in the layer stack. So if I put it in the layer stack and I shut it off, I can tell Particle World that I want it to look at that image to create the texture. So I go into Particle Type, Textured Square, Texture Layer, I want Skull Part, and now you can see that I've got tiny little fiery skulls flying out of my emitter.
Can you back up again one?
You bet. So I cut it out, save it as a PNG on alpha, import it into After Effects. Has to go in the layer stack. So you have to put it in the layer stack. Then you can shut off its visibility, right? Your particle type has to be a textured particle type. Generally, you're going to want to use textured square, right? So textured square. If you use textured disk, it's going to change. Like, you can see that it changed the way the skulls look. They don't look quite right now. So textured square has to be the particle type. And then you will see that it's spewing little tiny skulls out of your particle system.
And so where's it getting the color from?
It's pulling the color, so the color it's getting from the birth to death color. So like if you wanted to say make the skulls white, you could come up here to your solid settings for your particle layer and say make your particle white, or your layer solid white, and then change the color map from birth to death to origin constant, and now they're going to be white skulls. Or if you wanted them to change color over time, you could leave that as birth to death and change those birth to death colors so that you have your skulls changing from white to black over time. All kinds of fun ways to play with textures inside of this particular particle system. And then you could, make them fly at the screen if you want to. There's all kinds of fun things you can do with these. Scary skulls flying at the screen. Roar.
It looks like honeycombs.
Yeah, it's fun. I like that. It's like I said, this is great. Like if you can, if you go into Photoshop and like, I'm just gonna make a little smokelet real quickly. So if I come into Photoshop and I create just a tiny little, it's like I'll make it like 200 by 200. Oops, I don't want it to be that huge though. I want it to be 72 DPI is fine. So like I said, one thing to do that's a kind of fun way to use particle textures for like smoke and things like that is to create little smokelets. Smokelet. And I think you can actually find these assets pretty readily on the net. Like if you just look out there and type in like smokelet texture, you'll find a whole bunch of little smokelets that you can import and use as textures for particles. I'm just gonna grab a brush here and use just one of their built-in kind of little smoky looking brush. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Oh no, that's not very good. Screw it, I'm not even gonna bother with that. I'm just gonna go with like a nice soft brush, and then I'm just gonna grab like black and white and change the opacity a little bit. Oh, I can't use clone stamp. I don't want to use clone stamp. I want to use brush. And I want to use a soft brush. Oh, that's because I clicked on clone stamp because I'm dumb. Brush. Soft brush. 30 pixels. Let's make it a little bit bigger. So I just got black. I'm going to go with like a gray color. And I'm just going to kind of like create a few different little... Oh, that's way too much opacity. So I come in here and just kind of like create a little thing that kind of looks smoky and cloudy. There we go. Maybe move it around a little bit so it's kind of like that. And then we save this as a PNG file. I'm going really fast. You guys don't have to follow all this stuff if you don't want to. Not a huge deal. It needs to be a PNG. There we go. Bring this into After Effects, and then let's change the particle type to that smokelet. It does have an edge to it. You want to make sure there's no edges on these things. You want nice, clean edges on them. So if you need to like expand the size of them or go in and erase away the sharp edges, it'll help these things look better. But I made this in like 3 seconds, so I didn't spend a lot of time worrying about it. Again, I'm going to shut the smokelet off. Then I go into my particle world and I tell it I want it to look at the smokelet. And now you can see we've got these nice little smoke things right here. If we increase the birth rate quite a bit and then change the orientation of the camera, and maybe increase the birth and death size. So now we get this nice like volumetric looking smoke with our tiny little smokelet that we made in Photoshop in 5 seconds. So you can use that for a lot of different things. Like you can create your own textures, bring them in, add them to your particles, use textured discs or squares. You can play with, your random size variations and things like that to create some really good looking effects. If you try, I don't know, quad polys or something like this, you might get some crazy looking effects. Textured disc, that one looks pretty cool for smoke.
Did we talk about opacity now? We did?
Not yet, we're getting there.
Okay.
I'm kind of hopping around a little bit. I just wanted to show you guys how to use that. That's really one of the most powerful things about Particle World is being able to use textures. Textures are going to give you your best looking particles. Whether it's, creating little sparklets or things like that, especially for things like smoke. Like if you're trying to make realistic looking smoke, using little smokelets that have opacity on them, that's going to work really, really well inside of Particle World. Okay, so moving right along, I'm going to go ahead and reset this thing one more time, get it back to its stock look. Looks like its position is off a little bit here too, so I'm going to reset that. Okay, let's see. We went through all the different particle types. So you'll notice that when you open up certain particle types, you get a lot of other options like the texture thing, rotational speeds for things like cube. You get a lot of these options where you can make the cubes rotate and do different animations as they're like being emitted from the emitter. Custom color maps, so opacity maps. So opacity maps are kind of cool. So you can come in here and draw your own custom opacity maps and change the way that the particles are looking in terms of their opacity. So if you wanted them to be fully visible at the beginning and then fully visible at the end, you can draw your own opacity map. You can have them become opaque and unopaque, and like you can create your own crazy looking opacity maps in here to give your particles different looks. The stock opacity map is just kind of a ramp. It didn't actually change. We'll just go like that. That's kind of like your stock opacity map is generally just a ramp. Birth to death. So the color, which you're seeing right now, is being generated by this birth to death color map. You can come in here and you can change the color map to whatever color you want there. You can add custom color maps underneath the custom color map. So if you set birth to death to custom, you can come in here and set all kinds of different, like this one's kind of fiery, like if you wanted some crazy like sci-fi particles where it starts out blue and then turns neon green and then, you know, turns bright peach and then turns black and then turns white. Well, you can come in and set your own map and give it all sorts of funky colors if you want to. Volume shading works on anything that's got like a 3D particle to it. So if you change the volume shading, it will change the way that the particles are kind of lit. So you can have them kind of side lit. And you can also change the transfer modes. So you have normal blending modes like your overlay, multiply, all those blending modes that you can use in the After Effects layers themselves. You can also change the blending modes right here inside of the particle world to give them different looks. So like if you say use add, it's going to use an additive blending mode, and if the particles overlap, they will get brighter. You can use screen, which is a little bit more subtle effect in terms of the overlapping and them getting brighter or darker. And then extras. So extras allows you to control the camera, which you can just control with this gizmo in the upper left-hand side. So you can move the camera around to look at your particles from any direction that you want. You can also control that in the effect camera rollout in the particle system itself. I generally don't do too much of that when I'm working with particles. Let's see, what else can we play with here? Depth Q. This is kind of cool. So like, let's say you wanted your particles to like fall off into the distance or something like that. You could, if the particles are really huge, you can basically tell it like how far back you want it to render particles or how far forward you want it to render particles with the depth Q. Let's turn this on and just see what happens. Yep, so you can see that depending on where I set the distance, it's going to change the visibility of my particles. If I change the type, it's a little bit easier to read this when you see it. So things that are closer to the camera are going to be seen, whereas things that are farther away from the camera are going to be invisible. Fog, if you turn on fog, it's going to basically fog out your particles. So if you wanted particles in the background and they were, say, in haze or something like that, you could create the fog effect using the depth Q. Lighting direction. This is really handy, especially if you're using the 3D particle types. If you have specific lighting in a scene or a shot that you're trying to match, you can use the light XYZ to kind of control where the lighting is coming from. You'll notice that on the cube, if I move this left or right, the lighting changes up, down, left, and right. Hold particle release percentage. I don't really want to get into that right now. It's just a way for you to make the particle system hold until a certain percentage of their longevity. I don't think you're going to need it for this assignment. If you want to play around with it, you absolutely can. Random seed. Okay, so random seed is super handy. So let's say, for giggles, we're kind of trying to create a smoke effect, right? So let's go back to our textured square, set it to our smokelet, and set the setting to fire. So now we've got our smokelet, and I want my smokelet to be the origin constant color, and I want to change the birth size and death size. So we didn't really touch on that. I don't know how I skipped that. Birth size and death size. That basically allows you to tell the particle system how large you want the particles to be born and how small you want them to die. So if you wanted them to, say, be born at 5 and die at 0, the particle system is basically going to get smaller and smaller as it dies. So if I change, I'm going to move my position a little bit so you can see the whole particle system. So here's what the particle system looks like when it's emitting particles. And you'll notice that the particles get really, really small. This would be great for like that kind of a candle look almost. So if instead of using the origin color, we say use the birth to death color. Oh, that's fun. I don't know why it gave me the option from before. Maybe it's because I need to re-render. Nope, it's not. Okay, whatever. Where was I? Fire. Okay. Yeah, like you could use this to make a kind of a candle color. So if you wanted to colorize this, you could and overlay it a little bit. I'm going to change my birth size a little bit. And you're starting to see that that's working pretty good for smoke. Maybe change the velocity a little bit, slow it down. Maybe increase the resistance a little bit. There we go. So we kind of got a fiery looking little deal. And then you could add some additional effects to this. Like let's go ahead and let's use hue saturation on this thing and give it some color. So hue saturation, and then we say colorize and say make it like a nice orangey color and increase the saturation. Lightness a little bit. All right, so I was driving at seed here. So the seed is really cool. So let's say we wanted to kind of try to make this look a little bit more like a fiery candle or like some kind of fiery looking thing. Well, we can start to layer up the particle systems, right? So we've got our base particle system all set up. Let's duplicate it, and then let's add a blending mode to it. So in the toggles, click the toggle switches mode switch down here to get to your blending modes. And then we can start doing things like screen or add, which is going to brighten the particles over time. And if we change the seed, what it will do is it will change the way that the particles are rendering when they're born, right? So right now, the two are an exact copy of each other. If we change the seed, say to like 1, 2, 3, now we've got two different systems working at the same time. If we say duplicate this again and then add another seed to that third particle system, we'll call this 4, 5, 6, it's going to change that look even further, and you're going to start to get a more interesting look. Then let's just say take these two and duplicate them again, and you're going to start to get a more fiery looking particle system. So that's what I mean when I say layer up. Layering up and using blending modes is a great way to create more and more realistic looking particle systems. Another thing that we can do is say take one of these particles, duplicate it, and then add like a blur effect to it. So let's blur it, type in blur in the effects, and then go ahead and add, I'm looking for just fast box blur, there we go. I'm going to add a fast box blur to this and blur it way out, and you'll notice that it's going to start to get this halo to it, which is exactly what I want. I'm going to take that particle system and duplicate it again, maybe add a little more blur, duplicate it again, pull the blur in, and you'll see now we kind of got this nice little halo effect going around our particle system. And it takes a ton of time to render it. So we're rendering like 7 particle systems at the same time. So layering your particle systems up is really going to give you a wonderful look for your particles depending on what you're doing. If you're trying to make smoke or fire, the more that you kind of add and work with blending modes and additional particle systems, the better they are going to look. So that's the general overview of the particle system. Why don't you guys take a 15-minute break, and we'll come back and we'll make this hose spit some fire. So now we have to make our particles do something. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new particle system here real quick. And we're going to add particle world to this. And we've got our particle system. So I kind of want to make this look like it's pouring fiery looking particles and smoke out of this hose. Is it going to look absolutely perfectly like fire? No, probably not. But we can get relatively close enough so that it's passable. Would I use it for an effect in a major motion picture? Probably not. But we'll do the best we can. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we need to control the position of the producer, because we need the particles to be produced from like the opening of the hose. So let's start there. So we're going to go right into the producer right away. I'm going to kind of go back to the beginning of my composition where I can just see the emitter starting to emit particles. And I'm going to change the position of my particle system. And I'm going to kind of bury this particle system like way down in this hose, like right about there. And then what we're going to have to do with this is we're going to have to set up our particle system, and then we're going to pre-compose it and mask it so that we can create the foreground of the front of the hose in front of the actual particle system. All right, so we have the position of our particle system is looking pretty good. The radius is looking pretty good. Maybe we'll make the radius just a little tiny bit bigger. So I'm going to set the radius to like 0.030 on all the axes, X, Y, and Z. There we go. Particle system's a little bit bigger. So now we've got the position of it correct. Let's go ahead and start working with actually making it look like it's shooting out of the hose, right? So how do you guys think we should do that?
Change the particle to words. Hang on.
Cone axis, right? Or directional axis.
Yes.
Something that makes it look like it's spraying out of the end of the hose. And wow, direction axis works pretty darn good for that right out of the box, which is super nice. I also think we can start using the floor on this too. Let's go ahead and make the floor action set to bounce. Okay, so the floor is a little bit low right now, or high right now. So we need to change the floor position a little bit so that it looks like our particles are bouncing off of the floor. And that looks pretty good right there. They come out of the end of the hose and then start bouncing along the floor, looking like we're in the right place so far. Okay, cool. I think what I'm going to do is I want to bury that part producer in that hose just a little bit more. So what I'm looking for is I basically want to set this up so that like I can't really see like this part of the particles right here. So I'm going to change the position of this just a little bit. Y position maybe just a little bit. So one thing that might come in handy while you're adjusting positions and things like that is to hold the command key. So if you hold the command key, it'll allow you to make really minute position changes. Whereas if you let go, it's going to make really large position changes. So this is with the command key on, and I'm moving the mouse at the same rate here.
Oh my gosh, you probably just saved me some.
Command key on, command key off, right? It'll drive you bonkers. And shift will do the same thing, but it'll make the movements larger, right? So if you really want to move something fast, hold shift. If you really want to move something slow, where did the particles go? There they go. If you want to move something slow, hold command. All right. So I got my producer kind of buried in there where I want it. I kind of can't see like where the particles are being generated. I'm going to increase the birth rate a little bit more and just kind of really make it look like these particles are spewing out of the end of this hose. All right, so I'm going to play with the angle, the direction axis angle a little bit here to see if I can make it. Oh, that did not work. See if I can make this. Yeah, the direction, I really don't like the direction axis angle. It's just really wonky. Like, it does not want to do what I want it to do. It's like all or nothing. Okay, we're just going to go with it. We're going to go with it stock, the way that it is. Like I said, Particle World isn't the best ever, so we're just going to roll with it. All right, but, I mean, this is pretty good so far. We've got kind of our line particles shooting out of the end of the hose. Now we kind of need to make this look a little more fiery. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start playing around with different types. I'm going to change the birth rate of my line particles quite a bit here. I'm going to back it off to like 1, maybe even less, maybe like 0.5. And we're going to start layering up these particles. We're going to use different types, and we're going to start layering these up and using some blending modes and things like that to create a little bit more visual interest and try to make this, start to make this look a little bit more fiery looking. Okay, so we've got our line particles. I'm going to use those as kind of like a baseline for the fire. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my particles, I'm going to call this fire particle because I'm going to create some smoke here too at some point. So fire particle, I'm going to take my fire particle and I'm going to duplicate it. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to start altering this particle system a little bit to give it a better look. The first thing that I'm going to do is change the blending mode on it. I want the blending mode to be set to screen. And let's try add and see what happens. Okay, we're going to stick with add for now, but we might change it later. So I'm going to go into my particle and I'm going to start playing around with different particle types. Let's try that tri-poly out. Oh, okay, cool. That's looking pretty good. Maybe tri-polys because they have motion blur on them. Let's see about tri-polys with motion blur. I'm going to try to solo that so I can just see. I get nothing. Oh, that's because I did textured tri-poly. Let's go tri-poly. There we go. Tri-poly with a little bit of motion blur on it, and you can see it's set to add. I might take that stock fire particle and back it off even a little bit more. I'm going to set it to 0.25. There we go. And I'm going to set the mode. And I'm hitting toggle switches modes quite a bit here because I'm turning on motion blur and using different effects in the toggle switches modes. So I might be swapping between those quite a bit. I'm going to try like a screen. No, that's too much. We need to actually be able to see that these are indeed fiery. So I'm gonna roll with normal for right now. All right, so we got fire particle 2. We got some nice blurry looking polys coming out of there, and we're starting to get there. Let's keep working this up here. So let's take, and maybe what we need to do is a little bit of color correction on our hose first. So I'm gonna go hue saturation on my hose, and I'm just gonna pull out some of the lightness in that shot so we can make our fire pop a little bit more on our background. So that's a whole lot more. Ooh, those are kind of cool the way that they stick to the stick to the floor down there. I like that. All right. So we are going to keep layering this thing up. So I'm going to try again with the blending mode on my lines. It's just too much. I just need that to be normal, I guess. It gives it nice color. Okay, cool. And then maybe on add we're gonna go screen because we're gonna end up using a bunch of layers here. So I'm playing with blending modes. I'm moving things all over the place. All right, so we got some tri-polys coming out of there. Let's go ahead and start playing with maybe some birth and death sizes. So I'm gonna make the birth size a little bit bigger and the death size a little bit smaller on my tri-polys. So it's gonna give a little more heft to the particles that are coming out of the hose right there. And I think I'm going to increase the velocity too on my tri-polys so they get a little bit more of that sweet, sweet motion blur. So increasing the velocity a little bit. All right, I'm going to play around with a couple different looks here. I'm going to try quad polys too, just to see how that looks. It's not super terrible. Let's do this too. I mean, this is not a terrible idea to maybe reference some actual fire. Like, let's type in like fire tornado and see what that looks like.
How do you turn on the bouncy?
Okay, that's gonna be the floor.
Yeah,
Give me just a second. Oh yeah, see, that's what we want right there. Ooh, fire tornado coming out of the end of this thing. Okay, bounciness. So.
show me real quick.
Yep, that's no problem. Let me see, where the heck am I? Particle floor. Okay, so it's going to be under floor, and then you want to set the floor action to ice, glue, or bounce.
That makes sense. Okay, got
Okay, so we got our fire tornado. So our fire tornado is like really bright at the front, and it's kind of like tapering off at the back. So let's play around a little bit with our birth to death color. Let's make our death color a lot darker on both of these particle systems. So I'm just playing around with the death color a little bit, trying to get these a little bit darker. I might even go more orange with the death color rather than red. And I'm going to go back up to here and play with these colors a little bit more. Got really bright colors, lots of... I might even go like black with this almost. All right, then let's keep on layering this up a little bit. So let's take our fire particle 2 and duplicate it again, and then let's use that seed, random seed, 1, 2, 3, to change the orientation of the particles, and let's start playing around with other particle types. Maybe we do like let's try a tri-poly here, and then let's change the mode. And let's play with the colors too. Let's get these nice and rich. And I'm going to play around with blending modes a little bit to see what happens. Ooh, color burn's kind of cool. Might throw that underneath the other layer. That's funny. Okay. Okay, and I'm just going to keep on kind of working new layers of particles in here. I've got some colors that are kind of set to weird blending modes. Like I'm using color burn and color dodge and multiply to try to get a little bit more saturation in my fire. I'm seeing those nice red particles kind of pop through there. I might change up the birth and death size a little bit and then increase birth rate. Try to get a little bit more fiery looking. That's better. I almost wonder if I go back to my initial line particle, if I give that a little bit more birth rate and maybe change the transparency a little bit. And I'm just changing the transparency in the normal layer just to kind of help give it a little bit more thickness. That's better. Let's go ahead and I'm gonna go back to my reference and kind of look at that. It's got a like twisty thing going on it. So I'm gonna see if I can't do something with a layer of like vortex particles. We'll see if we can't make something happen there. So I'm gonna go in here. This is set to direction axis. I'm gonna set this to vortex. And then I'm gonna use the camera, the effect camera, to change the orientation of the particle system itself. So I'm gonna change distance, I'm gonna keep the same, but like orientation wise, there we go. I'm gonna change the orientation. I mean, can I make this like, actually I might just change the gravity vector. Gravity vector, let's change that so that it's 1 on the x-axis and 0. Oh, it just wants to fly straight up no matter what. Crazy. Let's see if I can't make these do what I want. Whoa, hey now. Ah, there we go. So now I'm kind of able to use the vortex version. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the resistance to pull the vortex in around. Oh, it doesn't let me use resistance. Boo. Boo hiss. Well, maybe I can kind of use it as like a little sparky looking thing coming out of the front. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, that doesn't look very good. I'm kind of bummed that I can't use resistance on that. Let's see if we can't maybe just make them bounce off the ground a little bit more. Something kind of like that. I was hoping we could tighten up that vortex a little bit and make it look a little more interesting. Alright. Then I think we just need to add some more, like, substance to this stuff. Let's see. So let's try to maybe add just a couple more layers in here. Let's duplicate this one. Go in here. We're going to change the random seed a little bit. Give it a different look. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set this so that I'm only looking at like one little bit of the fire. So remember to use your beginning and end to set your animation. So you don't have to preview the whole 10 seconds. You can preview just a couple seconds of your particles so that you can kind of preview and see what they're looking like without too much hassle. Let's see. Let's play around with these. Nope, that is way too much. Ooh, crazy. Play with some colors here. I'm playing with blending modes a lot. Trying to get things to look interesting. I might even like double blending mode this thing by going into the particle effects modes. Trying some different modes here. There we go. Now I kind of got that like more rich red looking color there near the end. It's nice and bright near the beginning. I'm going to keep working with some of these other fire particles. If I solo them, I can kind of see what they look like to begin with. I'm going to go into this fire particle 2 and duplicate that one. And then I'm going to play around with some more of the settings here. Specifically, I'm going after like birth and death size. So I'm going to make the birth size a lot bigger on this one. The death size a little bit bigger. Yeah, there we go. Now it's flowing good. All kinds of fun stuff happening here. Alright, maybe increase that size variation a little bit. Velocity's looking good. What happens if I increase the velocity a little bit? That looks pretty good right there. Alright, we're getting there. Is it going to be like award-winning weighted digital fire? No, but it'll work for what we're doing. Alright, so I kind of got my fire where I want it. It's not perfect, but I think it would pass as like you understand that it's not supposed to be water coming out of the end of this thing. So let's do this. Let's add some smoke to it. So I've got my fire particles. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate one of my fire particles and then rename it smoke particles. And then in the smoke particle, I'm going to go into the particle itself, change it to a textured square. And I'm going to set that texture to that little smokelet that we created earlier. Now the render times are going to go way up. And then let's go ahead and just solo this so we can see what we're looking at. Just got our smokelet rolling now. Wow, it really, really is taking its sweet time to render this thing out. There it goes. Okay, so we got the smokelet going. We need to change some things around though. Let's change the birth size. Let's increase that, and the death size. Let's decrease that just a little bit. Oh, this might actually work pretty good as an overlay. Let's see. Not terrible. What happens if we do add? Ooh, there we go. All right, I like that smoke is fire, so I'm going to call this fire smoke 1, and I guess I will duplicate that and create the actual smoke from the next one. So we're going to call this one smoke. I'm going to solo this again, and then I'm going to get right in here and start playing around with the physics a little bit. So I'm going to slow this down. I'm going to set the gravity to like half, And then we're going to change this from direction axis to, let's set it to fire. Whoa, straight up. Okay. I don't think I want it to go straight up like that. I'm going to go back to direction axis, and I think I'm just going to change the way that this direction axis is directing. Oh man, direction axis is awful. How about cone axis? Can I tell it where I want it to go now? Okay, so I need to change the gravity. So I'm going to go gravity negative 0.5, not negative 5. There we go. And then I'm going to let these live a lot longer, the smoke. And I think what I'm going to do with the producer on this is I'm going to stretch the producer out on the x-axis and move it over a little bit. Kind of unsolo it and see what it's looking like. All right, we need to actually see it. So in terms of the particle, I'm going to change this from birth to desk to origin constant, which is going to give me my gray particles. I feel like the velocity is still way too fast on this. I'm going to set this to like 0.025. And then we're going to change this to normal instead of that. We actually want to be able to see our fire through it.
Where was the normal?
I changed, that was the blending mode that I changed right there. And then I think I might go, let's see, max opacity. Let's turn the max opacity way down. It's a little better. Play around with the birth and death sizes a little bit. Velocity is still way too much. Need to get that gravity down a little bit. Okay, now bigger birth sizes, I think. Bigger death sizes, I think. And then let's see. There we go. A little bit of screen on that to help it out a little bit. I'm going to pull the opacity back just a little bit. I might even just like stretch that producer out a little bit more and let it kind of make smoke for the whole stream of fire that's coming out of there. Change its position a little bit. Maybe give it a little bit I'm gonna set the velocity way down. That's better. Bless you!
Thank you.
Play with the velocities and the opacities a little bit. All right, so we're getting there. Okay. So for your assignment, like, this would be plenty good, you guys. You made something look like smoke. You kind of made something look sort of-ish like fire. And this would work. Like, if you came into class and said, I made a hose that spewed fire instead of water, I would totally pass you for this. This would totally work. Let's see. So let's like the next part, we want to be able to cut the spray of fire off where that hose is, right? And so the way that we're going to do that is we are going to, I think instead of pre-composing all of the particles together, what I'm going to do is take the hose layer and kind of create a foreground layer and stick it over the top. And here's why. If we pre-compose all of these particles, watch what happens. We lose all of our blending on the image, which sucks. We don't want to lose our blending. So we have to keep our blending, and we have to figure out a way to basically cut off the particles where we want to cut them off. And so the easy way to do that is just to take the hose itself. I'm going to duplicate the hose layer. Then we're going to bring it up to the top, and we're going to go in and we're just going to cut out part of the hose right here and use it as a foreground layer and blend it in. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to select my hose, get in here with my pen tool, zoom in a little bit. So I did Command plus to zoom in, and I'm kind of going to start like right here in kind of the middle of this hose, and I'm just going to come in here and select this out and kind of create a nice little selection for the foreground of this hose. I'm going to select, I'm going to just select all of this right here and kind of let this run out like so. I'm going to go all the way to the other edge of the screen. So I'm going to just kind of come over here and then bring this in behind. And there we go. Maybe feather that mask just a hair. Two pixel feather. Now we got this nice little, you know, cut off front layer. Here's with and without. So without, with, without, with. Let's see some other things that we can do here real quick. Whoa, hey now. Yep, that looks pretty good. The other thing that might be kind of fun to do is maybe use a little bit of layer solid action to give the, like, where the fire's coming out of the hose a little bit more color and vibrance. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new layer. Actually, I'm just going to use shapes for this. So I'm going to grab a shape. I'm going to fill it with the kind of orangey color that we've got going on. Maybe a little more orangey than yellowy. I think I might use blending modes for this. So I don't have any layers selected. I'm just going to kind of create a shape right in here. Like I basically just want I want this to look like hot. So I got this shape layer. I want this to look, you know, kind of hot. And then what I'm going to do is get in here and use some blending modes. Maybe hit add. There we go. And then how about a little blur on that to help it out a little bit. Fast box blur. Set the blur radius up a little bit. There we go. And then Lena was asking how to make a flash earlier. So I'm going to kind of skip ahead a little bit and show you guys the wiggle tool. So the wiggle tool is kind of fun. What am I getting texts for? I don't know, whatever. So we've got this, it's looking pretty good. And it actually has that kind of like wiggly look already. I'm gonna actually duplicate, I'm gonna go like Fire Origin 1. I'm gonna duplicate this and blur it out a little bit more. So I kind of got this like glowy thing going on right there. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. And then I'm going to take Fire Origin 1. So Lena was like, how could I make something flash in the background? And I said you could use wiggle. So wiggle is an expression that you can use to randomly generate numbers on any parameter, right? And it's pretty easy to use.
No such thing as random. The same.
Yeah, close enough. Computers are pretty damn close to random. So let's create some kind of random wiggle here. So I'm going to hit Option and click on the little stopwatch, and that's going to allow me to type in an expression. And we're going to do a lecture on expressions later in class. But I want this basically to wiggle the transparency on basically by 100 constantly, so that it's always just like doing little transparency changes. So I'm going to type in wiggle and then parentheses, and I'm going to have it, I want it to go like, I don't know, I'm going to go like 20 comma 100, and I'm going to see what happens. Let me solo this so I can see if this is actually working. Okay, so there you can see it's kind of flashing like a little candle, right? That's exactly what I want. So it's wiggling the transparency 20 times per second, anywhere from 0 to 100. So it's basically randomly generating transparency wiggle. And I'll do this same wiggle on the Fire Origin 2. So on transparency again, hold Option, click on the little stopwatch, type in wiggle, and then we want wiggle, and I'm going to do a different number on this one. I'm going to go 30 comma 100, and we'll solo those together, and now you can see that we've kind of got this nice little pulsing origin where the particles are coming out. Yeah, there we go. That's looking kind of cool. Or hot, whatever. Neat. So there you go. That's pretty much it. I want to give you guys some time today to work if you want to. That's going to conclude the lecture for the evening. If you guys have questions on anything or want help with anything or want help trying to get a specific type of particle for your project, or if you want help with ideas or anything like that, I am here till 8:50. If you feel like you have a handle on it, cool.